Any passerby can enter and use the public lavatories in government buildings, while citizens of color who do the work of the government are excluded. As equal citizens, we are entitled to freedom from discrimination. Have you a new freedom for white Americans and a new slavery for your Afro-American fellow citizens? God forbid. William Monroe Trotter, 1914.
The same man who declared a new freedom for the United States ordered the segregation of black Americans in federal buildings. Back in 1896, the Supreme Court had upheld the separate but equal laws of the American South in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. In the years that followed, racial segregation hardened throughout the South. Across the nation, the signs of segregation appeared over hotels, theaters, and water fountains. Worst of all, this era also witnessed a new and vicious outbreak of violence against black Americans. Between 1885 and 1907, more Americans were lynched in the United States than legally executed. The vast majority of the victims were black.
One of the underlying issues that made racism violent and dangerous in the early 20th century was that most black people were powerless. So in the early 20th century, even though there was a great migration of black Southerners into the North and into the East, about 90% of black people still lived in the South. In the South, almost none could vote. They lived in a situation of segregation, which meant separation, but it also meant separate and terribly unequal.
As segregation and violence spread, black Americans began a sharp debate about how they should respond. On one side stood Booker T. Washington, president of Tuskegee Institute. On the other stood W.E.B. Du Bois, a Harvard-educated historian and journalist. Born in 1856 to slave parents, Booker T. Washington founded Tuskegee in 1881 to help blacks learn useful trades. Instead of pushing for immediate equality, Washington said, blacks should develop vocational skills.
To those of my race who underestimate the importance of friendly relations with the Southern white man, I would say, cast down your bucket where you are. There is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. In all things that are purely social, the races can be separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. Booker T. Washington.
Where Washington counseled patience and gradual uplift through hard work and black self-help, W.E.B. Du Bois demanded immediate and equal rights for African Americans in schools, housing, and employment.
Mr. Washington insists on thrift and self-respect, but at the same time counsels silent submission to civic inferiority. Is it possible that 9 million men can make progress in economic lines if they are deprived of political rights? By every peaceful method, we must strive for the rights which the sons of the fathers would fain forget. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. W.E.B. Du Bois, 1903.
Other Americans lost their rights because of the content of their opinions rather than the color of their skins. One major target of persecution were the socialists, who believed that American workers, not their bosses, should own the nation's industries. Socialist Party candidates won offices in over 300 cities, including Milwaukee and San Francisco. In the 1912 presidential election, Socialist candidate Eugene Debs won almost 1 million votes. To Debs, the Wilson-Roosevelt dispute over the size of American corporations made no sense. All that mattered was who owned them.
The Republican, Democratic, and Progressive parties all stand for private ownership of the productive machinery used by workers. The Socialist Party is the one party which stands squarely for the abolition of industrial slavery. Eugene Victor Debs, 1912.
This message struck fear in the hearts of the country's law enforcement authorities, who tried to silence the socialists by jailing them. Debs himself would be arrested and sentenced to federal prison for opposing the draft during World War I. Another group persecuted because of their opinions were the Industrial Workers of the World, or Wobblies. Like the socialists, the Wobblies thought that laborers, not corporate kingpins, should own the nation's factories. But where socialists preferred to work through the polls, the IWW called for strikes and sabotage against big businesses. So businessmen organized groups of vigilantes to harass and intimidate Wobblies. Like Eugene Debs, hundreds of Wobblies would be hauled off to prison during the First World War.